Hi, I'm Melanie Marcus. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer of SureScripts, and I was the group lead for the Stakeholder Engagement Work Group. A few words first. Amazing. I'm so honored to just be amongst all of you. This is a true convening in healthcare. True convening. When you bring all these amazing minds together across stakeholders, across groups in healthcare to solve some of the biggest, most complex problems we have with technology. So really amazing to be here. And it's not something that happens every day, but it does happen every day at the Sequoia project. So we're really lucky in that way. This work group was focused specifically on making sure that the groups who are engaged in this work continue to evolve to be representative of groups who need to be engaged for the projects that are on tap for any point in time at the Sequoia project. So I'm going to talk about that work in just a minute, but I have two things first. Two things. So I learned a lot from Dr. Stephen Lane. Yesterday, I learned two things. First, I learned last night, so there's not a lot of time to make changes, that stakeholder is not necessarily the right word. So we're going to have to change that, but I'm not sure that I can do that between last night and today. So I'll play around with it as the presentation goes on, but we will be changing that. So thank you. I also learned about the hashtag pink sock movement. How many of you know about that? I'll see, I'm late to the game. So I have my pink socks. And I thought I would just highlight it because it seems apropos for this particular work group and the work happening in this room. The pink socks movement, I went online last night and I watched the TED Talk and the whole thing, right? The pink socks movement is not necessarily about healthcare, but it is about being seen. And all kinds of groups adopt it for their own purposes. And isn't being seen really what this work is about? Across different groups in healthcare, being seen for the interoperability work that we're doing. And isn't interoperability about being seen, patients being seen, right? So thank you for alerting me to the pink sock movement. I think I have my allotment in the mail. All right, so we're gonna go on and just talk about this work group for a minute. If you're in the room, I know we've got a number of people who are in the room. Nahit, I see you. Why don't you stand up? Brenda, I see you. Chandra, Chantel, I see you. Rita, awesome. So we had a small but mighty group working on this project this year. Really some great work, and we all learned a lot. We all learned a lot about each other, a lot about healthcare. So we did this work in 3 phases. The first phase that we did was around assessing the market, assessing current state, and I will talk about that. I'll give you kind of the outline of what we found in these 3 phases. We did some interviews with Sequoia leaders. We did a survey, so most of you probably received the survey. If you don't remember it, it was in the spring. Just asking about why do you engage, why do you think people don't engage, that kind of thing. Then we did some analysis, we did some additional research, and we did do some prioritization, which I will talk about in more detail. And then we came up with our recommendations. So I'll end it with the recommendations, okay? The first thing, when I said we learned a lot about healthcare, we've been in healthcare for a long time. I've been in it my whole career. How many stakeholder groups do you think there are in healthcare? More than 10? More than 20? Infinite? You know what? There is no right answer. And we debated this more than we thought we should. We thought this was a slam dunk. How can this possibly be that we're still debating this? And we still are, and we still will be, and we'll need to monitor these definitions over time. Ultimately, we came up with 13 major categories and 7 subcategories in health information technology. Now, already we would probably change some of this. I'll give you that in a minute. But what was important here was that we were mirroring some of the way the Sequoia project has collected its data over time so that we could see the trends. So some of these groupings are based on data over time. And then we got questions about, well, what about telehealth? Well, what about cybersecurity? Where does that fit? Well, then we said, something's wrong with this health information technology group. It's very large, and it's constantly growing. And you know, there are no real definitions of health information technology, though I found a few articles, which we did cite. So that we actually included 7 subcategories here. We could argue, and it has been argued, and we probably should, go back and in another time we should add subcategories to some of the other areas. But anyway, we started with the definition of who are the stakeholders who are possible, and this is where we ended up for the work that we did this year. All right. I'm going to go through some of the data on the current membership. And remember, this was done a few months ago, so even this has changed. But Chandra did some great work here on this, looking at all of the data the Sequoia project has collected over time, and really started with 10 founding members 10 years ago. 10 founding members 10 years ago, and now this data says over 80. Marianne shared at the beginning of the meeting that it's almost 90 members 10 years later. So that's phenomenal, phenomenal growth, right? And the representation is interesting. So if you look at this graph, it basically says that 3/4 of members, 3/4 of members are either a health technology vendor, a health information network, or a provider, sorry, or a provider. 1/4 of members, so that's about 20, are spread amongst these other groups, members. So they're still engaged, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Plenty of people engaged who are in other groups who are not members, but just looking at members, this is a 25% are made up of this other slice. Interesting. Not necessarily wrong, but interesting. And then just in terms of where, starting, like this is the board composition right now. The board composition is based on, up to 4 provider organizations, up to 3 health information networks, up to 3 health technology or service providers, health plans, and you can see the rest. So that's the state of the state on where membership is today. When we did the survey, we actually asked another question that may or may not seem as relevant, but we were to expanding stakeholders, but we were looking at not only expanding stakeholders, but thinking about how do we make sure that we're collectively, engaging everybody who's already a member, all of you, right, like who are already a member. So we asked the basic member satisfaction question, the Net Promoter Score question. How likely are you to recommend the Sequoia project to a friend or colleague? And if you know the Net Promoter Score, that means it's on a scale of 0 to 10. I'll just go here. If you answer anywhere from a 0 to a 6, you are considered a detractor. If you answer a 9 or 10, you're a promoter, and you subtract the percent of detractors from the percent of promoters, and you get your Net Promoter Score, which is never 100, so don't judge 55 on a 100-point scale. It's never 100. That would be probably somebody did something to their survey. So 55 is what it came out, and by the way, 55 is it's a great NPS. And so you can see some of the scale here. It's really great. You do see companies, but very few up in the 70s, very few are up there. So this is a great place to start. And you'll see in some of the recommendations that we recommend continuing to evolve this and continuing to measure satisfaction and get feedback on satisfaction and how people are engaging. All right, why do members engage with the Sequoia project? We asked this in interviews, we asked this in the survey, and when we looked at all of the data together, there's lots of reasons, but we pulled it down to just a few, and hopefully these resonate with all of you. Biggest benefits for engaging with the Sequoia project: mission orientation, right? Make an impact on the health. We heard that all day today. Making an impact on healthcare, bringing healthcare information to consumers the way they need it, when they need it, making sure public health is really connected and set up for a crisis, and being heard, having a seat at the table. And we heard that when we heard the whole TEFCA panel, right? And the QHIN panel, being heard, having a seat at the table. And what are the biggest strengths? Cross-industry convening, like this. This is not an everyday occurrence in healthcare. It's great when it happens. And relationship with the government. And you saw that yesterday. We had some speakers, right? Some great speakers. Mickey was here. And then we had our speaker this morning from CMS. So great opportunity to hear what's happening in Washington, D.C. and to experience it and have input. We also asked the other side of the coin, right? Why don't people engage with the stakeholders, with the Sequoia project? So we heard the basic, like there are competing opportunities. And why is that important to note? Because of course, like that's always an issue. It's important to note because if we reach out to a particular group who isn't really impacted by the work going on that year, we're probably not going to have a lot of luck. But if we reach out to the group who's really impacted by the work that's going on that year, public health, for example, right? Or consumers, patients, for example, then we're probably going to have some luck and we'll have a great value proposition for them and so forth. And they won't have as much of a worry about competing priorities because we'll be in their priority zone. Some may be on the fence about TEFCA. It's just a fact. There may be every group, and this were just some call outs that were specific, wants a focus on them, right? So like, what are you doing specifically for payers? What are you doing specifically more for HIEs? And then there was definitely a constant pattern of hearing more, a need for more engagement with FHIR and with HL7. It just came out in the interviews and in the survey. Opportunity areas, communicate more with, this is also kind of fun. This is where I spend some time in my other part of my life, is communicate more with members, communicate, right? So we'll talk about communications in our recommendations coming up, but that came up a lot. People want to hear more about what's happening with the Sequoia project, be informed. Promote the amazing work that's happening here in this room and across all the projects and work groups with the Sequoia project in the industry. It's like this hidden gem. You know, a lot of people don't know about it quite the same, and that there is some brand confusion. It's just, there is some brand confusion. You probably understand that. All right. We also asked, and some of our work group members here in the room, Heat in particular, I'm looking at you, we're really focused on like, all right, if we're gonna engage people, engage stakeholders, we probably better know what their priorities are around interoperability. So we asked them. We asked them during the interviews and we asked during the survey. And you're being asked again this week, and you'll be asked and asked and asked because that's the key, right? What are the priorities? So this is what we heard this summer and early fall about priorities. Data usability, we heard about that today. Patient matching, information blocking, we heard about that. Public health, you can see, you know, this isn't the be-all, end-all. This is of us point in time from a survey. And there's more, you know, we'll get more input from all of you today and ongoing. All right, so that's the data piece. That's what we collected. I will say we went out to some stakeholders who are not engaged, like represent groups that are not engaged. And we actually ended up stopping that work for a couple of reasons. First, it was hard to get the interview. It was just hard. And then second, because it was hard, when we got the interview, we were talking with some groups who were actually interested in engaging. So we thought, wait, when we get the interview, when we get the conversation, we should be talking about engaging and not why not engaging. So we decided to kind of pend that work for the next round, and you'll see what that is. All right, I'm going to move on. If you have questions or anything throughout this piece, raise your hand. We will pause at the end for questions and discussion. We went into prioritization. So there are a lot of groups in healthcare who could be engaged in this work. How do you prioritize who to go after next? There are precious resources in helping to really focus on engaging additional healthcare groups. And we did this with a prioritization tool that we developed, and now the Sequoia project has it, and it can be used time and time again, refined over time. So I'm going to explain it here. In the way that we did it in this group, we looked at 3 sets of criteria to rank the priorities of stakeholder group engagement against. In a future, it could be 1 set, it could be, but we chose 3 based on the work that we were doing. We looked at the Sequoia strategic plan and pulled out 7. We looked, of course, at the TEFCA use cases, and we looked at the research that we had done to see if there were other things we needed to rate this work against. So overall, we looked at all of these criteria in these 3 groups, okay? And we had literally a spreadsheet that set up all of the stakeholder groups against all of the criteria, and we had people contribute their ratings to whether that stakeholder group was important to that particular criteria or not. And we summed it up, and we came up with our prioritization. That spreadsheet, that prioritization tool, basically in Excel, but it's a prioritization tool, is something that, as I said, the Sequoia project has. The priorities can be changed year over year. The stakeholder groups can be changed year over year. And the way that the survey is done can be changed year over year. And that will be a key component of our recommendation coming up. But anyway, this is where we came out in our work group. And based on all of this, that CMS is a top priority. Government, public health. I mean, we just saw public health, but we saw public health groups, expanded presence from like the FDA, et cetera, right? Could be used as we look at the use case in TEFCA around public health. Consumers and patients, that was a great panel, so exciting. I see Shanna over there. And health plans. Those were the ones that, at least in this group, based on this prioritization exercise, came out as higher priorities. But you can see, there's plenty of fodder for that discussion here. All right, there's lots more data behind that, but I'm going to go to the recommendations, and there are 7. 7 recommendations, which already the Sequoia project is working on. You all saw a member survey even before we came here that is reflective of some of that. First, board composition. This isn't to say that the board needs to be expanded, or it's just to say, look at the stakeholder list, look at the stakeholder priorities for any given year this year, and just be reflective of, for example, health information technology is a big category. There are 3 slots. Is it covered? Maybe there's an opportunity to expand liaisons from the government, for example, just to consider. Definitely an at least annual prioritization exercise for the stakeholder groups. Every year will be a little different. The group participating will be a little different, and the priorities will be a little different. And so the priority of who should be reached out to will be different. And develop and implement a stakeholder engagement plan. So many of you know this kind of approach very well. What's your value proposition for the stakeholder group you're going after? Who's the list of targets, and who's going to go after them, right? And what's the goal for the year? It seems simple, but it's in this work, it's actually called out and something that's important to put some discipline around. And I know that already that's happening. Brenna's doing some of that work right now. The next page of recommendations are all about you. They're all about members, really. Making sure that as members, we, SureScripts is a member as well, are engaged in the right way, that we're satisfied, right? What else can we do to participate differently? So continue to do some kind of an annual satisfaction survey, and everybody give input because it will be listened to. Develop a member engagement program. 10 years old, like, it's amazing the work that's happened in 10 years. And there are many organizations that at this point or so, you probably are involved in some of them, have some like pathways for new members, for example. They might take a new member and assign them a mentor, you know, or say, hey, if, as a new member, here's a work group. Here's how you should engage in a work group as a member of the work group. And maybe then you go to work group leader, and there's like a path for a member. So how do we engage members in a way that's meaningful for them so they stay engaged and involved in the Sequoia project? And then finally, member communications. The word newsletter came up a lot, and I know it's being considered. And it was one of the questions in the survey that just came out last week, just to keep everybody up to date on what's happening. There's so much happening. What's happening? Newsletters, it could be, you know, convenings within convenings, meaning, you know, a lot of us go to HIMSS. How can we meet there, for example? And then the final recommendation was just to consider other work groups. And there were a couple here. They might be board level. They might be other work groups. There could be something around member engagement, could be something around additional stakeholder prioritization, or communications. So with that, I want to thank those who are in the room here and who aren't for engaging in this work, and then just open it up for questions or comments. All right. Well, it's almost 4 o'clock, so I don't blame you. But I think that may mean we're ready for the next session.
I have a question I'll ask. Matt Blackman from the Sequoia Project.
Great.
Was there anything that particularly surprised you, or anything that you think can be a big opportunity for us to continue engagement?
You know, that's a great question. I don't think none of the recommendations, I don't think you all probably look at them and are like, of course. So I don't think any one was necessarily surprising. It was just satisfying to see the whole kind of picture of stakeholder engagement as a discipline be presented in that way. So it's more satisfying than surprising necessarily. I would ask you, is there anything surprising for anybody here? Take that as no. All right. Are there any other questions? Okay. Great. Well, thank you very much.